Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast. I'm Nachum Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is proudly sponsored in honor of Rabbi Bornstein's renowned Daf Yomi shir, a shir that has inspired and enriched countless listeners with its clarity, depth, and warmth. Many listeners of this podcast will no doubt find the shir both meaningful and engaging. The shir is available on the Liquid Daf Yomi app, Oldaf, 24/6, Apple Podcasts, and a variety of other platforms. Please see the link in the show notes to learn more and start listening. To sponsor an episode of the podcast or to support the podcast in any way, please email me svarmchatter@gmail.com or see the link and information in the show notes. You can also find the link in the show notes to subscribe to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp community where I post new books, new Svarim, book deals, and more, as well as a link to the Svarim Chatter WhatsApp status, which is more of the same if you prefer to see it that way. Finally, if you can please subscribe to the podcast and rate and review the podcast wherever it is that you listen. Also, Rabbi Moshé Kravetz, who is the guest on this second episode of the Rav Yosef Karo and Sefer HaMaggid series, is publishing his next volume of the Sforno, critical edition of the Sforno, Ravadia Sforno. This one will be on Eve, and Rabbi Kravetz is looking for support to publish it. So if anyone is interested in supporting that, you can reach out to me also as farmchatter@gmail.com, or if you're on the WhatsApp chat, you can message me via WhatsApp. And with that, enjoy this second episode of the miniseries. Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast and another episode in the mini-series on Rav Yosef Karo and Maggid Meisharim. On this episode of the mini-series, I'm going to be joined once again by Moshé Kravetz, who is the editor and machaber of the Sefer Sforno, new edition of various Svarim of the Sforno. And thank you, Moshé, for joining me once again.
Thank you for having me once again. It's very exciting to be here, especially to speak about such an exciting subject.
Yeah, Rav Yosef Karo and the Maggid Meisharim specifically is very exciting and fun. And so the first episode we discussed Rav Yosef Karo, touched on the Maggid Meisharim. In this episode we're going to get more into some aspects of the Maggid Meisharim, specifically the reception history and its print history, which although nerdy in some ways, it's very bookish, is very, very important when it comes to the Maggid Meisharim, and especially when it comes to the new Avad Shalom edition, as we'll be discussing here. So let's jump straight in and let's talk about the Maggid Meisharim and its reception history. And by reception history, we mean even before it was published. You'll tell listeners when it first was published, but understand that even in the age of print, as I've discussed elsewhere on the podcast, there was manuscript culture. You had work circulating in manuscript. There were those that were reading and interacting with things. So let's start with the reception history of Maggid Meisharim right away when it was written.
Okay, so you defined it very well, because the reception history over here of the manuscript is a whole story in itself, because we're speaking about all kinds of different manuscripts, different families of manuscripts, and that's where Avad Shalom comes in and makes a whole new history of the print, because they're actually printing a new book which was only in manuscript but never printed without having the actual manuscripts. So what's going on here is Rav Yosef Karo is writing the manuscript of the Maggid Meisharim, the Sefer HaMaggid. He's writing it in his lifetime when the Maggid is speaking to him. Now it's very interesting because the Maggid is telling him to write it, which means that every so often he even gives him over the head, why haven't you been writing? I've been speaking to you, you haven't been writing. So he was expecting him to write. And not only that, but he's expecting him to write and to show it to other people. How do I know that? Because in some instances, he's going to tell him, a certain person is a gilgul of someone, which I don't want to say, I don't want people to know exactly, so I'm going to write it in codes so that people don't figure out who we're talking about. Well, actually today, if you take the Avad Shalom edition, you have it very black and white. They figured out exactly what it is about. But it's clear that the Maggid, his intention was that he should write it to be read by other people, and Rabbi Yosef Karo is giving it out, showing it to other people, and they're copying. Now, the way they're copying is very interesting because there's a bunch of different variants. Some people get different parts, and some people write it in different ways. It's going to take 80 years since Rabbi Yosef Karo dies until it's going to be printed. And in that time, we have tens and tens of manuscripts, and all of them are different with different orders, but it's all coming from the manuscript of the Beis Yosef. One of the main people involved in the manuscript story is Rav Moshé Galanti. So Rav Moshé Galanti, the Chuvas Maram Galanti, is a Talmud of Rav Yosef Karo, and Avad Shalom managed to identify two manuscripts which he had written. Now, one of them had been written even when Rav Yosef Karo was still alive. So he had access, and he was writing. So that's already the first and most important source we have for the manuscripts. But what we know about the manuscripts when he was alive is there are other sources which tell us that other Talmidim also had access. For example, the Ramak is 455th Yortzeit, I think, was just now on Chof Gimel on Friday. It was his Yortzeit on Shabbos. When we're recording Chof Gimel Tammuz. So the Ramak actually quotes Kabbalas Moiriv Rabbi Achosid Rav Yosef Karo, Natre Rachmano, Nehru, which means he's like Shlita today. He's speaking when he's writing it when his Rabbi is still alive, and it has to be when he's still alive because the Ramak, who was young, he predeceased Rav Yosef Karo by a few years, 5 years. So he died in Shin Lamed, which is 1570. And he's writing something that from Kabbalas Moiriv Rabbi, from what Rabbi Yosef Karo received. And he's writing it in Aramaic, and actually it's a quote directly from what we have in the Maggid Meshorim. So we know that 5 years before Rabbi Yosef Karo was Nifter, already his Talmidim are already transcribing the Maggid Meshorim and quoting him. We have also the famous letter of Shlomo Alkabetz, where he also speaks about the Maggid, and that's also something which was written still where he's speaking about a Chosid, Shlita, and in whatever language they call Shlita at the time. But we have some other interesting things. For example, the Sefer HaMaggid. You had a podcast on the Sefer HaMaggid of Reb Chaim Vital. That was a very, very fascinating podcast because it's a very fascinating Sefer. And he actually over there records, Reb Chaim Vital, that the Maggid of the Beis Yosef told the Beis Yosef to tell the Alshich, Moshé Alshich, the Alshich HaKodesh, that he should invest all his strength in teaching Reb Chaim Vital, because he's the one who's going to be after him. So he's quoting something that the Maggid told Rabbi Yosef Karo, and this is also written very, very recently after Rabbi Yosef Karo. And there are other sources in Avat Shalom. In their introduction, they have a list of different Sforim which were printed right after or written during the lifetime of Rabbi Yosef Karo, all quoting. You have from the Sefer Haredim, Rabbi Loza Azekri. That's the right way to say it, actually, Azekri. And Rabbi Yosef Di Segova has a Sefer Devev Stif Seyeshenim, which he also quotes it very, very close to the time of the Beis Yosef. So it's really going around.
So as you show, that really means it was traveling around and being received in manuscript. I think of it like a Word document traveling around now, or even a PDF, but like a working copy that circulates somewhat on the internet or on WhatsApp. That's the comparison sometimes for modern age as to manuscript culture. I guess a rough comparison, but it was traveling around, so it was known and it was being used and it was being looked at. And then we get eventually to the print. And let's talk about the first edition of print and what they did, because this is very, very important to our story where, Avat Shalom now, if you look at the new one, it's a Sefer HaMaggid and there's a subtitle, Maggid Meisharim. And it's arranged differently. And we're going to talk about that extensively. And so we're going to leave more of we'll maybe get in some of the content here and some in episode 3, and again, there's a lot of the nitty gritty because it's so important to this story where the book is actually called Sefer HaMaggid, not Maggid Meisharim. So the printers added the name Maggid Meisharim. They arranged it, they'll say their parsha, etc. So I'll turn it back to you to talk about that. What's happening when it gets to print? What happens exactly?
Right. So actually what happens is very interesting because we missed out a small point that happened before it gets to print. And that's the fact that different students get the manuscript, but they're working with the manuscript in different ways, which means that when Rabbi Yosef Karo is writing the manuscript, he's writing it as it goes along, which means that every so often he's going to sit down and write. It sounds like you see from how it's cut up that sometimes he would write for a few weeks in one go, but he's writing as it goes along. So it's not according to any order, to any certain parishes or something. But then in the manuscripts themselves already, and the first one who's doing this is actually the student of Rabbi Yosef Karo, is Moshé Galanti, who his two manuscripts are the main source for Abad Shalom, and the two manuscripts are fundamentally different because one is a copy from the Maggid Mishram as it's written by Rav Yosef Karo, and the other one is already trying to make it into Sefer on the parashas, which Sefer on the Torah, which means he's trying to take whatever was said on a certain parasha and put it in a certain place. So he's doing like cut and paste and making a new type of a Sefer al Torah, which if you try to look at it as a historic document, you're losing it. But for something to be learned, parasha, you want to learn what the Rav Yosef Karo, what the Maggid has to say on Parashas Pinchas. Okay, so it's Givaldik, so you have exactly what you need on the parasha. So now, when it gets to print, it's already after it was made into a Sefer on the parashas. That's the Maggid Mishram which gets printed. And that's the only one that we know of, as long as we're busy with the print, ever since. So when does that happen? It happens in 1646, Tov Vov. Then a Shadar from Yerushalayim, Rabbi Yitzchak Binga, comes to Poland and he prints in Lublin in Tov Vov in 1646. He prints the first volume, which covers from Parshas Bereshis till Parshas Mitzvah, and he also adds the letter of Reb Shlomo Alkabetz. Reb Shlomo Alkabetz wrote this letter. Actually, I don't know if he wrote it as an introduction or that Rabbi Yitzchak Binga saw that it would be a good introduction to the Maggid Mishram, so he puts it as an introduction to the Maggid Mishram. Now, something that we have to say is something that I left out, is that the Shlo already, in his Sefer Shlo, which was printed even before that, he already quotes not only this letter, but also different pieces from the manuscript of the Maggid Mishram. That means he's printing it already in Europe, even before the Maggid is actually printed. So that's in Tov Vov. Now, a few years pass by, and in only 3 years actually, in Tov Tes in 1649, now we're in Venice. And if you ask why we're not in Lublin anymore, it's quite simple, because 1646 to 1649 is Tachtat, when it was in Europe, which means that you have the Khmelnytsky massacres, and that's why probably the second volume is already, there's not too much money to be made by the Shluchim of Eretz Yisrael in Eastern Europe, so they're in Italy now. And that's where they print the second volume. And actually, the Rabbonim of Tzfas, in their Ascoma to the second volume, they write that the second volume was still in Tzfas, which means that actually they only had the first part when they printed it was from Parshas Bereshis to Parshas Mitzvah. That's all they had. So it's very interesting. It means that it was already in the manuscript version made into a Sefer, and the Sefer was divided according to parashas, and they had only the first half of it. So the first half is printed in Lublin in 1646, second volume in Venice in 1649, and that's the first edition. Now the second volume is printed by Rabbi Yitzchak Binga again, but he has now someone who joins him in the printing, Rabbi Elisha Chaim Ashkenazi. Does the name ring a bell? Rabbi Elisha Chaim Alevi Ashkenazi was also Lashvadar from Yerushalayim, and he has a very, very prominent or famous or infamous son called Elisha Nostan, Nathan of Gaza. That's his father is actually giving out the Maggid Mishram, which is very interesting because the whole story of Shabtai Tzvi starts off with the Nathan of Gaza having this vision and passing out, like dying or something, like on Shavuos night, right? Which is very, very similar to the story of the Shem Alkabetz with the Maggid. So his father was the one actually who published the second volume, not the one with the letter of Reb Shlomo Alkabetz. Now, I'll remind you something, Nachi, I'm not sure you remember. He had a podcast in the series on Shabtai Tzvi. So he had a podcast about Nathan of Gaza. What was he? Why was he so important, and how was he so successful in giving out the message? That was because his father, which is the one who published now this Maggid Mishram, he was actually the Shadar, which means that he was in charge of going around the world to make money for the people in Eretz Yisrael, but which means also that he was keeping contact with all those communities by letters. So he had this whole, how do you call it? This whole
Yeah, the communications network. I mean, we said this there,
Exactly,
I think.
the communication system. Right, exactly. Well,
It was a social media campaign. He had his WhatsApp chat and his Instagram.
exactly. So
and he was
this is where it starts. This is exactly where it starts. So Elisha Chaim is the one who printed the second volume. So he's the father of Nathan of Gaza, and he's like Rabbi Tzuk Binge. He's also a Shadar. Actually, sounds like he was a big Talmud Chacham also. Most of the Shadars were very important people. So that's what we have now. The first time it's going to be printed together, the first and second volume, will only be in Amsterdam in 1708, Tov Samaches. That's how long it's going to take. Another 150 years until, not 150 years, another 60 years until it's printed in one volume. So that's that's the print history.
Manuscript history. There's even more to get into. I want to mention we're only, scraping the surface. If anyone wants to go really in depth, you can check out the Vat Shalom edition on page 87. There's a whole diagram of starting the Rav Yosef Karo and then the different families of manuscripts, how they're related. It gets very, very complex, and they did a really excellent job in the massive introduction. It's a complex issue, and why it's important. Oftentimes you look at old Svarim, or new editions of old Svarim rather, you'll see they use certain manuscripts and they edited it and they took one as the main one, for those that like that type of thing. But let's emphasize to the listener, why is that so important here? And we also should talk about Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach, who Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach was. I think the listeners know who Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach was, and his role here, especially as the Vat Shalom edition discovered, in recreating let's call it the authentic Sefer HaMaggid, because that's really what it is. So let's talk about, again, why is it so important to know the different manuscripts and who wrote what and who edited what in the story of specifically when it comes to Sefer HaMaggid versus, regular Sefer when you have different manuscripts.
Right. So over here, why it's really, really important is, first of all, because it's written as a diary, but it's printed as a Sefer on the Torah. Now, if you're a historian, you want the diary. You don't want the Sefer al Torah. If you're working with the Sefer al Torah, and that's what the historians had for very long, and you just look how all the historians are trying to figure out when this was said, when this happened, and try to reconstitute the biography of Rav Yosef Karo through the Magen Sharm, and they're having a very hard time, which makes some of them come up with very, very creative ideas. Like if you take the biography, which is a very, very comprehensive biography and a very, very good work of Mor Altshuler, it's a very comprehensive biography. But if you see how she tries to interpret, to give her interpretations to all kinds of mystic languages, which is based on basically because there is a lot of mystical language. You can't knock that, but there's a lot of things that you can read exactly as they are, but the problem is that if you don't have it written in a certain order with the real dates, and this is important to know because it was printed actually, they didn't take out the dates, they left the dates. But they made such a mess of them. First of all, the dates a lot of times have mistakes. And also sometimes there's a piece which is two pieces together, and then you think that it's actually continuing from that date, and you make a whole story. And so you have Worblovsky and Altshuler, and they're all fighting about, was this first, did this happen then, and what does this mean, etc. And then when you get it and read it as a diary, it's all clear. It's like written there. You can't even, there's no two ways to go. So that changes the story completely. So it's much more important than any other new edition of a Sefer. That would be one thing. Now you mentioned Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach. Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach is a very, very interesting personality. First of all, he was from the Anusim, which means that he was a Baal Tshuva who became one of the biggest Mekubalim. He started off as from knowing nothing, and he came to Eretz Yisrael, and he was the one who disseminated the Kabbalah of the Arizal. Now he over here in his introduction, which he writes to the Sefer HaMaggid, which was published by Abba Shalom, is very interesting because he has a big problem, because there's a lot of Kabbalah in the Sefer HaMaggid, but it's not the Arizal's Kabbalah. And for Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach, there's only one Kabbalah, and that's the Ari. So he has to cope with that. And he's writing a whole introduction to tell us that, no, you should know that not everything in the Maggid Mishram is true. Because a Maggid has certain mixtures from other places, and it's according to the madrig of the person receiving at the exact time when he's receiving it, etc. So you should know that if something doesn't work out with the Kabbalah of the Ari. That's because there are mistakes here, which is actually an idea which we're going to accept also, because when we come to the part about the halacha, etc., so we're going to have to come on to some type of understanding that you can't accept Maggid 100%. You always have to know how to understand, how to analyze where it's coming from, and otherwise you're going to have problems against halacha as well.
Yeah, that's something that we're going to discuss. That's definitely, there's various issues, so to speak, with the Sefer HaMaggid, which is something that we're going to get to, especially in episode 3. A lot of the content, I'll tell listeners already, we're going to get to really in episode 3, and we mentioned the letter of Rav Yosef Karo with Shavuos night. That's a whole different thing. That's, it's like, although it's printed in Sefer HaMaggid, that's not something that happens with the Maggid. That really kind of predates it, but that's something that we'll get to, and all the different things, the various Torah in the Maggid, we're going to get more specific examples, those cited, etc., and things like that. But for now, so you mentioned Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach, and Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach, Amat Shalom, found that, his manuscript, we should talk more about his manuscripts. But maybe before that, because just to go back on what we were emphasizing before, which is, just to give maybe an example or two for the listener to understand what we're saying instead of just abstract, which is the Sefer HaMaggid was a diary. Think of any diary that you know. It's written as a diary. Someone comes to, to the Maggid. The Maggid's coming to his car and telling him, hey, I'm coming to this and this date. It's time to do this. It's time to do that. What he's talking to him. And then there's Torah mixed in, there's Kabbalah mixed in, there's all sorts of things mixed in there. And then the work is taken and it's turned into a Sefer HaTorah. Ramesh, like you said, it becomes a Torah Sefer. It's a regular Sefer. They leave in dates, they make mistakes, they make errors like printing mistakes, etc. But it's now a diary in a Sefer form. It's a little funny. And what Avat Shalom did is they put it back into a diary, and they even added new material that wasn't in the old one. So it's really two different svarim. Maybe, at least I kept the old one. I had the new edition of the old one, Al Torah, where they would translate the Aramaic passages, and I kept both. They're really two different svarim. It's the same content, but rearranged differently. It's almost like, I don't know if the best comparison, but maybe like when an arranger, you see a song is arranged, and the arranger can arrange the music. You can do it two different ways. So it's the same song, but it sounds differently. So it's different, and maybe it's even more dramatic here, more drastic, the change. So I don't know if you have an example where they can show the listener like something that it's done in the Al Torah edition, and then or something that's now done in the new diary edition to show the contrast of what happened.
Yeah. So I'll give a few examples where it really helps us. For example, I think we spoke about it in the last episode, that the Maggid appears when Rabbi Yosef Karo is learning Mishnayos. And actually he starts appearing before he knows the whole Shas of Mishnayos by heart. And he's instructing him to carry on and to finish off. And he's telling him what's going to happen when he finishes, when he knows all the Shisha Sidra Mishnah by heart. And he tells him exactly how many chazoros he's supposed to do, how many repetitions, and how often he has to go over it. Really giving him very, very, very clear instructions. There's another thing that the Maggid is speaking about is, for example, his writing of the Beis Yosef. Rabbi Yosef Karo starts writing in Reish Pei Beis in 1522. And so he's actually telling him sometimes, you wrote a halach like the Rambam. Over here, in this case, it shouldn't really be like that. Or, you said three answers to the Rambam. One of them was okay. The other one was okay. And the third one was, Akadosh Baruch Hu likes when you start speaking learning, so you can leave it in there. So he's like really, he's speaking exactly about what sugyas he's writing on. Now, if you take the printed edition, you get completely lost because you're going back and forth because there's no dates. So in a certain parasha, he's speaking about when you're going to finish Seder Kodshim. And then there's another parasha where he's speaking about 2 months after he already knows the whole Shas Mishnayos. And there's some things that are very, very different. I'll give you an example of something that I realized. That was because I was going through the storm of Reb Shlomo Alkabetz. It's an astonishing thing. Reb Shlomo Alkabetz has, since he was really part of the whole story here, that we'll speak about later on when we get to the Leil Shavuos, but he was really, he's participating in a lot of these stories. He's actually mentioned quite a few times. Sometimes he's mixed up with Reb Shlomo Molcho. That's a whole parsha when Shlomo Kedoshi and Shlomo Bechiri, etc. But Reb Shlomo Alkabetz is the one who instigates the whole going up to Eretz Yisrael, and he's behind everything. So sometimes in Reb Shlomo Alkabetz's writing, we could find a lot of things that explain different things in the Maggid Meshuram, and sometimes he quotes things that were that we could see directly that come from the Maggid Meshuram. In one instance, Reb Shlomo Alkabetz is speaking about the difference between Chutz La'aretz and Eretz Yisrael, and he tells him something like, and Reb Shlomo Alkabetz writes that the Ananei HaKovod, which were in the desert with Klal Yisrael in the desert, they could only be in Chutz La'aretz. They couldn't be in Eretz Yisrael. There's no Ananei HaKovod in Eretz Yisrael. There's no such thing, because in Eretz Yisrael, there's a Gilui Elokus, and you don't need Ananei HaKovod. Okay. What's very interesting is that in the Sefer HaMaggid Meshuram, you're going to have many, many times where he tells you, when you finish the Mishnayos, you're going to have 6 Sidrei Mishnah, which are 6 Ananei HaKovod, and then you're going to have the Amud Onan in front of you, 7, you're going to be Zeichit to such a Shros HaShechina, etc. And he's speaking about this Ananei HaKovod. And what I thought when I saw this Reb Shlomo Alkabetz and the Ananei HaKovod, which I mentioned in the Maggid, I started thinking to myself, 1 minute. He's telling him that he's going to be Zeichit Ananei HaKovod. Where? He's in Salonika when he's writing this. So it doesn't work. It does work. When he's in Salonika, it does work. But after he's going to be in Eretz Yisrael. So I actually started going through, each time he speaks about these Ananei HaKovod, which has to do with the Mishnayos, and then I realized something fascinating, that it's only when he's in Chutz La'aretz that he speaks about Ananei HaKovod, and he changes when he goes into Eretz Yisrael, when Rav Yosef Karo moves to Eretz Yisrael eventually. He uses not Ananei HaKovod, but right. So when he's in Chutz La'aretz, he's always speaking about the Anonim, that he's going to be mukaf from 6 Anonim with the Ananei HaKovod going in front of him, etc. When he finishes the Mishnayos. When he's in Eretz Yisrael, so I was looking, is there any Anonim mentioned? And I realized that he suddenly changed to Olman, Olomis. Suddenly it's world, it's not Anonim. And it's like tens of times, and you can see exactly. Actually, it's one of the Mamorim, one of the pieces which Avachan didn't manage to date it, but at least I could say that it was written in Chutz La'aretz, not in Eretz Yisrael, because he's using Anonim and not Ilomim. So that's something very interesting, and you see how important also the knowing when each thing was written, because it's really you understand it completely differently. The whole Sefer is a different Sefer.
So oftentimes, these are told to him during various times of the week, and we talked about in episode 1, and various times during the year. So the Divrei Torah related to the parsha, wherever it is, either the Maggid just tells him, or it's related to the parsha of the week. So that's the Maggid's telling him, and that's how it got turned into a sefer. But here, as you're saying, it's not only an autobiography, you actually see things that change, because you see when he's in Eretz Yisrael, and when he's in Chutz La'aretz, and you see changes depending where he is, depending what year it is, depending what he's being told by the Maggid. So you actually can see that, because you're reading straight. So it's kind of a mystical diary, if you will, with Torah and all different things being told to him by the Maggid. It's not like your regular mundane diary, but it's going in order. And you see this in some extent. You see this in Oldham, but you see it here also when it's El time and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. He's thinking about Yom Kippur. And when it's Yom Kippur, he's thinking about Yom Kippur. And then you have Pesach and Purim, whatever the Yom Tov is. He's thinking about the different times when the time comes.
Right, and it's even more than that. If you speak about Rav Yosef Karo's family life, which means he was married quite often, that we know. And what actually happened, and how many times did he marry? So if you read the Maggid Meshuram as it was printed, you have a very, very hard time with it. And historians are really fighting tooth and nail to try to figure out if he was married 3 times or 4 times or 5 times. And when you have now our version, it's like very, very clear. You know exactly when each marriage happened and when the wife in question died and where he went to look for a shidduch. It's actually very clear because it really, once you read it as a diary, it's unbelievable the way they managed to put together. And once again, they're putting it together. Abba Shalom not putting it together from a manuscript which they found, which is actually on the original order. They have some of that, but it's like only on very small parts. But it's working on families of manuscripts, which means that they managed to analyze which manuscripts come from a certain family, which means that the original copy from the Rav Yosef Karo's actual manuscript which was already changed in a certain order, they managed to reconstitute the whole lines, and which was copied from which, and which was built out of which, and then they go back to try to put a date on most of the pieces, which they did quite successfully. But once they did the job, I think that we'll be able to help them out, because I myself had been able to give a date to another, like about a dozen pieces, and I'm sure that there are other peoples will be able, and they're very happy. I sent them the data. They were happy to get it. They told me that they're going to include it in the next edition. So if anyone has any more ideas of some things that you could prove when it was written, etc., it's quite important, because not everyone today gives out an edition and is interested in hearing feedback for the next edition. Avat Shalom is.
Which is amazing. It's important that it should be added in. And as you say, the family of manuscripts, you really can see that in the diagram on page 87, where they really break down the different ones. Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach has like the father manuscript, and then they, who wrote it, and then they break down the different manuscripts. Moshé Galanti, exactly, Moshé Galanti, and then they really wrote out the different dates, and it really just reads as a diary. And again, I hope we're emphasizing enough. Listeners listening, like, well, I don't understand. You can read the one on Chumash, Maggid, Mesharim. What do I, No, you really need this one. But I want to ask you, like, is someone buying a Sefer HaMaggid or a shul or whatever, should they have both? Do they need both? Are they so dramatically different in your mind that both are still required?
I don't know why you would need the old one.
Get rid of it.
But, no, it's just like even if you're interested in the Torah, in the Torah material, which is great, and I don't know how much I understand about the Kabbalah part, but even there's lots of things that you could understand, which are very, very interesting from a Torah point of view. But it's so much more exciting when you could go along with Rav Yosef Karo when he's learning Seder Kodshim, and he tells him what's going to be when you finish Seder Kodshim, and then you see it actually happen at the end of Seder Kodshim, that he tells him, oh, you were Zeichet to this Madrega because you finished. And at the same time, he's writing his Bes Yosef, and he's telling him about this sugya, and about a certain machlokes. And you figure out that exactly at that time there was a machlokes. He's writing on mikvois, but he's also having a machlokes with, I don't remember who it was at the time. He was with one of the other poskim about exactly that sugya, and it's a sugya which appears in the Jewish Bes Yosef and other Jews of the time. And he's writing his Bes Yosef, and there's also a reference to the whole sugya as what's going on in the background. It's so much more interesting, so much more alive. So I think it's if you have this, you don't need the whole old editions, unless it's Shemiske Yavchin, to be able to appreciate what they did.
Yeah, there's also a lot of really personal, intimate details in here throughout the Sefer. And again, in some of those were not in the Sefer Maggid Mesharim, but they're now in the Sefer HaMaggid. Really autobiographical details that, some people reading be like, well, why is this in here? Why is he writing this? What's going on? It's a real diary. He's writing exactly what was going on. He went here and then this happened to him and then he went into this. And like, you mentioned there's different, his wives and his family life. And he really has a lot of things in here mixed in together with the Maggid, exhorting him, you got to do this better and you got to do that. And they're talking about you in Shemayim and Hashem saying you should do this and etc. There's a lot of different, some are longer and some are shorter, so it really depends on each passage.
Yes, but once again, Rav Yosef Karo is writing this and giving it to be transcribed by students, which means that he didn't have any problem with this personal information.
Right.
Actually, there's so much to learn from.
Right, and it brings to mind when you have Gemara has all the stories where the Amoraim used to go into the other Amoraim and say, I have to learn everything. So you really see a lot of this in here. And many times, the Maggid, that is, in fact, gives techacha to Rav Yosef Karo and, tells him he did something wrong. So, for example, Siman Lamed, it's Leil Shabbos, Chov Tes L'Shvat. And the Shvat, and it says, it starts off, Achalti, v'yashasisi harbe, I ate, and I drank a lot, v'lo shanisi, mishnayis, b'tchilas halayla. I didn't learn mishnayis, Rav Yosef Karo says at the beginning of the night. V'yashanti kol halayla. I went to sleep. V'kamti ba'arayim, I woke up in the light of the day. V'yischalti likas mishnayis, and I started learning mishnayis. V'hinei kol dodi devik v'aymer. The voice came and it said, Hashem imcha v'chulu. And it says, Afal pi shayoroi la'ozchol and achcha b'sibas mashasisa lechol l'sava v'lishtis yosim midai l'sbatam atam b'tayra. That's telling him, if someone understands the depths, the soid of the Yomim and Leilos, v'griyusan v'shlemusan, Yedea, you know, ki guroyin v'chesaron laila achas ein la tashlumin. If you lose it out, there's no tashlumin. You can't make it up. Umalacha leilech achar meichel mishte. What are you doing? You're eating and drinking. Meaning to say, you're supposed to eat just for sustenance. Not supposed to eat like a party. You get full from a little bit. When you eat, it should be for you, for sustenance, not for enjoyment. And it goes on and on. It's long, and it keeps going, trying to give you a flavor of the Maggid is giving him teichacha. You see Rav Yosef Karo was doing, he tells you what he was doing. The Maggid is, and you imagine Rav Yosef Karo, he's saying he ate and he drank and went to sleep, and the Maggid is yelling at him, what were you doing, what were you doing, what were you doing? And he's giving him drushes, this is what the pasuk means. So you kind of get a flavor, especially in an autobiographical sense. And even if it's on a parsha, you're reading like a vort, the parsha, it's like, but as an autobiography, you see where it is. It said the Shvat, this is what he's doing. You can kind of see what's going on. And he keeps going. He keeps talking about it, and he says, and he says, "Why? This is why I shouldn't come to you. I really shouldn't come to you because but I did anyways." And Rosh, I know you have more to say on this, where the Maggid gives him teichacha. Oftentimes, how he says things that he did wrong.
Yeah, but first of all, you have to realize that there's a lot of teichacha, but there's much more praise, and that's
for
quite
sure
important. It's like the praise are unbelievable. Like what he's telling him, what they hold of him in heaven, and what the Pamala Shalmala say about him, etc. And who he is. He's a Tana, and he's the biggest of the big. So there is a certain, it's not just the Chaycha. Now, what's important to realize is that sometimes, because we now have the dates, you realize, actually why the Rabbi Yosef Karo was negligent, if you could say so, about certain things. Like one Friday, he's giving him over the head because, he wasn't mechaven and shnai mikra v'echad targum. Like he said, you just like you were dreaming, you were daydreaming while you were doing shnai mikra v'echad targum. But then we realized that there was a plague going on, and it's a plague where Rabbi Yosef Karo would lose his wife and 3 children, and you understand what's actually the background. That you can only know because now we have the dates, because Abba Shal managed to put back the dates. Or also sometimes when he tells him that he's been drinking too much, he says, so you think that it's a refuah? It's not a refuah, and it's just a taiva. And what's he speaking about this refuah? Well, he was speaking again during that plague, and they probably thought that drinking wine in such a situation would probably be some type of an antibiotic or some type of protection. So he's saying, no, and that's the situations on which he's getting the teichecha, which is unbelievable.
And I want to continue also something fascinating you see. So I was reading the passage before, and it's a long passage, and he talks to him. So then you get to the next one, Orli Yoim Shabbos Vav La'adar. He goes, right, he says, Hashem Emcha V'chulo, and he says, Rak, ki sidbak bi'u b'serasi v'yirasi mi'oid, you were connected to me in my Torah. You didn't enjoy this world, like I commanded you, like you did this week. Hayom Hishlamta Arboim Tiny as Resufim getting Arboim Savlad did 40 fasts in a row. The Alpha P Shabaharbe Behem Nenis Bel as you had Hana. Become welcome keeping your Arboim Vegam Hoyo Parsha. Show him in the scalp of Vini Itcha. It's died him and he goes on. He saw him begin something on the Parsha. But you see it's a continuation of what was happening. And they're going to go to the next one. Yud Gimel Adar. Hashem says, really, I shouldn't come to you this week. This week you didn't listen. This week was not a good week for you. And he tells him, you should. So you kind of see, you're seeing the flow. You're seeing the Maggid come to him and not come to him and back and forth. And this is the one Maggid, you're going to go to Eretz Yisrael, you're going to go to Eretz Yisrael. So you kind of see the flow and you see what's going on. It's not just, again, like you were saying, but just to emphasize, listen, it's not just like a vart, a parsha, and a story, and like whatever, shtickle Torah. There's a flow, there's a real autobiography here.
It's an ongoing story.
So this is, and you even have the little, details. You have when his daughter gets married. You have, when he gets married and things he was doing, like we were saying. You see the connection to the Yamim Tovim. So you really see a lot of the connections. Now, something that, and we're going to get more into the content of the Torah and those that are quoted in it, like you said, Kravetz or Molcho. the halacha is mentioned in here, some interesting stuff, what's going on with the halacha and things like that. But just, it's so important to emphasize, and we could sit here doing another hour on emphasizing all the different examples from here. And obviously, Moshé, if you think of any of the examples, I'll just tell the listener. But let's talk about something that the reception history. So now we have the Avat Shalom edition. But you said that corrected something, which was the reception history over the centuries, and especially the academics and non-academics, like Rabbi Greenwald, I don't know if we mentioned him, from Columbus, Ohio, and his work, and others, and Heinrich Gratz, and various contemporary historians, where did Rav Yosef Karo write Maggid Meisharim or not? This is a question. Anyone's familiar with the work. Obviously, there's some things that we read in here, some things that we didn't read are disturbing. But even what we just read, let's even take what we just read there. For Greenwald, just and for others, which is like, oh, I drank a lot and I ate a lot and I slept through Friday night and I went to sleep and I didn't learn. Right? That's very disturbing. How could Rav Yosef Karo say such a thing? What? Rav Yosef Karo wrote this work, and there's many other things in here also more disturbing. So that led him to say from a pro angle, and the academics to say from the other angle, from different angles, this is a forgery, this is a fake, Rav Yosef Karo didn't write this, we don't know if Rav Yosef Karo is a makubal otherwise, right? We know of him as a Bal Halacha, this is a baloney Sefer. And they had various issues with a lot of the dating, a lot of different things. So talk about that, first of all, and then we'll talk about why the Avat Shalom, as you say, rectifies a lot of these issues and proves that it definitely was Rav Yosef Karo who wrote this.
Right. So first of all, I'd like to rectify a bit the way you asked the question, because I wouldn't say that the problem was with the fact that he ate and drank and didn't learn. That wasn't what was bothering most of the people who had an issue with it. And the real problem was people who are anti-Kabbalah, who couldn't really wrap their heads around the fact that Rav Yosef Karo was also a Kabbalist. And if we go back to the Wissenschaft, the Judentum, to Gretz, etc., so for them it was like the Kabbalah is like a false science which corrupted completely Judaism. And as I liked very much when one of Gershon Sholom's students wrote about him, that his problem, that Gershon Sholom, you have to understand, he was the one who managed to make Kabbalah such an important subject, while he was making fun of the 19th century Jewish historians. But he didn't understand that the difference between the 19th century Jewish historians, because they were still traditional, and if Rav Yosef Karo actually believed in Kabbalah, and if Kabbalah was a real thing, so it had some kind of, I would say, they don't have to act upon it, which they didn't want to. While Gershon Sholem was anyway non-practicing completely, so everything could be as authentic as you want, but it doesn't mean anything for me, so why not? So actually that's what's happening when you take someone like Gretz, who was quite traditional, but he can't stand the fact that the whole mystical tradition, and he thinks that's phony. So when you get to Rabbi Yosef Karo, who's like the major halacha person, he's and you see he's systematic, he's rational. He could put the Beis Yosef on the whole Torah and the Kesef Mishnah, and suddenly he has these. He's seeing things, he's imagining things, he's also going. So they came, first of all, where was this manuscript? The manuscript wasn't published in Rabbi Yosef Karo's time, right? It came out only 70, 80 years after he died. So it was made up. Someone wanted to make up. And actually, they're even blaming the person who wrote it, that he's trying to make fun of the Beis Yosef. Because according to their perception, it's not serious. So first of all, we talked before about all the students who quote him, even when Rabbi Yosef Karo is still alive. So there's no question about it. You have even the Emunas Chachomim, Rabbi Aviat Sar Shalom, who has a whole chapter dedicated when he's speaking about the people who don't believe in Zohar, which means that for him, someone who doesn't believe in Maggid Meisharim and someone don't believe in Zohar is the same thing. It comes from the same place. And that's very interesting, where the Radal also in his Kabbalah Zohar also refers to the Maggid Meisharim. And it's the Radal has this brilliant idea, because one of the things that the Maggid is always telling the Beis Yosef is that you're going to die al Kiddush Hashem. You're going to be burnt on the stake al Kiddush Hashem. And we know that it didn't happen. Besides for one Taimani manuscript where they made up a story to fit it, that he actually died al Kiddush, almost died al Kiddush Hashem, but it never happened. So along the generations, they had this question, the Maggid's telling him, and it never happened. So come the historians and they say, okay, so you see that it's a fake. So Rabbi David Luria, the Radal in Kadmos Hazayah, he says, if someone's trying to make a fake, the last thing he would do would put in something like that didn't happen. That's the biggest proof that actually the story was true, which means he was told that by the Maggid and it didn't happen. Because if it was a fake here, he wouldn't do such a thing. He wouldn't put in something that didn't happen. So where it gets very interesting is Rabbi Greenwald. So Rabbi Greenwald, Nachi, maybe you know more about Rabbi Greenwald to give the introduction of who he was before we go into his issue with Sefer HaMaggid Meshorim.
At one point, when I was reading his biography of Yisrael, I think 2 years ago, I was looking a little bit into him. He was a prolific writer and historian. I mean, he knew a ton of information. He was Hungarian, and he was from Columbus, Ohio. I believe that, I think he has descendants around, maybe some are listening, and I believe that his shul eventually, I think, if I'm saying this correctly, as far as I remember from looking back then, maybe eventually became Reform or whatever it was, but he wasn't. It was an Orthodox shul. He was a Rav, and he was a big historian and a massive. I think his library went to Hebrew Union College. I don't remember the exact story. I'm probably not saying it exactly correctly, but he was a real historian. He wrote many works on either Hungary. He wrote also on, he would write on every topic. He wrote on, Sanhedrin. He wrote earlier Kufas. He wrote on Rav Yosef Karo. He wrote on Maril, I think. He wrote a number of historical monographs, if you will. And Rabbi Yosef Karo, so one of the things in there, it's a nice biography. It's well written. He writes nicely. But one of the things is he rails against Gratz. He curses out Gratz and he curses out the academics. And for him, it's almost, I took it as it didn't sit. I'll let you talk about why it didn't sit right. If it didn't sit right with him, and especially to fight against Gratz, he was like, no, it's a fraud, and you fell for it. You're attacking Mr. Karo as being like a, Kabbalist, saying weird things in autobiography. And by the way, I want to throw in over here that when I was saying before, the eating and drinking, that's to modern sensibilities. 100%. I didn't mean to them, the academics. I think to modern listeners listening to this are probably like, wait, what? How could that be? So, of course, to us, we understand that, but I think it's important to emphasize that the modern listener sometimes things that we hear, I'll just say as an aside, we have to make sure when we are listening or reading material from Gedolim of yesteryear, of Jews of yesteryear, that we can't look through our glasses here of the 21st century. You can't do that. You have to. There's different time, different place, and we can't look of either our 21st century tinted glasses or what we assume. We project, especially in today's world of. People have certain projections of what things look like or in their mind, or that's what they were taught. Maybe it's not their fault of what things look like and what, people did or didn't do. And again, it's Gedolim. We don't talk about, we wouldn't say, oh, he did that or the other. But again, this is autobiography. He wrote, he did this, that, and the other. So that's what I was trying to bring up. But going back to Greenwald, why do you think he did that? I mean, he writes clearly, Greenwald he's emphatic that it's a fake and it's a fraud and it's a baloney, and he really goes after the Sefer HaMaggid. And this is a from Rav historian.
So first, to go back about Rabbi Greenwald, his name is Rabbi Kusiel Yehuda, right?
Yeah,
which today has very interesting connotations. That's not what he was. He comes from the same geographic place, but he left there before it became Kanoim, right? He was a Rav in Columbus, Ohio, and his library, you're right, his library was given by him to the HUCA. And the reason for that was simply because they were very nice to him, and every time he needed a sefer, he would call them up, and they would send him the sefer by mail for use.
And to be clear, Hebrew Union College, which is the Reform, is nearby in Cincinnati, so it was close to him. I just want to listeners understand that.
Right. And they were very nice to him, so that's why he decided his library should go to there. That's why, because they helped him out with any sefer he needed. They would regularly send him anything he needs. So, but he was an Orthodox rabbi. He was also a historian, mainly about Hungary. Where it starts off, it's very interesting because the first time he writes about it, I think, is in Kol Boile Avelus, which was one of the very popular form on Avelus at the time. And actually, because of this, there was a whole thing if we should be using the sefer or not. By the more. How should we say, ultra-Orthodox people who had problems with someone who would write such things. So he's a big misnagid. So he's Hungarian, but he's not all your typical Hungarian. He's like a big misnagid. In Hungary, you didn't really have misnagdim. And you didn't have the type of misnagdim who have problems with with beliefs and with superstitions, etc. But that was his problem. He was a very rational person. And, for example, when he speaks about the Kaporis, he sees the B'Seisif about writing that the Kaporis is the Minik Shtus, which doesn't appear today in Shulchan Aruch, right?
Yeah, that's just exactly. Kaporis says Minik Shtus, and the original Shulchan Aruch, and then it was taken out. Now it doesn't say Minik Shtus anymore. Even though Rav Yosef Karo still holds we don't do kaparas, and that's in the Ramban, I think, and other Rishonim, or the Rashba. It's other Rishonim, and then the Ramos says you do, and Ashkenazim do. But if you look in the original Shulchan Aruch, you can see Minig Shtusu. It says on kaparas.
Right. So for him, Rav Yosef Karo writing that it's a Minig Shtus, that means that he's an anti-Kabbalist as I am. That's how he sees it, and so whoever would try to contend that he wrote the Magen Meishorim is just trying to make fun of the Beis Yosef, to try to make him into a superstitious person who believes in foolish things. That's how he sees it. And now he's very upset at Gretz, because Gretz, the way he puts it is that we know that Rav Yosef Karo mentions Reb Shlomo Molcho in the Maggid Mishorim. And Gretz says, you know what happened actually? Rav Yosef Karo was under the spell, under the influence of Reb Shlomo Molcho, and that's why he got into these type of superstitious imaginations, etc. And so the way that Greenwald sees it is that as long as you say that the Beis Yosef wrote the Maggid Mishorim, you're trying to to degrade him. So he went on a crusade to try to prove that Rav Yosef Karo did not write it. And he did it in a few phases. Once he started off a little bit in his Kolboy, and then he had a Sefer he put out in 1954, I think. Now, how does that have to do with anything? It comes in. But then finally, he gives out his Sefer Harav Rav Yosef Karo Uzmanoi, and then he has like chapter after chapter to prove his point that it can't be that Rav Yosef Karo wrote the Maggid Mishorim. And he's like really, then he's already going on to fight against someone who was like, a lot of people had fights with him. So it was a very good opportunity for him. That was Rameir Amsel of the Hamor, right? So it was, already, you have someone to speak to, because they're each writing back and forth very, very sharply. So one of the things he brings, for example, is he actually says that the Vilna Gaon never saw the Sefer HaMaggid. So he says, Reb Chaim Volozhin writes in his Akdama to Sefer Tzniusa, he has his whole introduction, where Reb Chaim Volozhin says, Ubedidi Havuv, the story that happened to myself, that the Goin sent me to my younger brother, Reb Zelmaleh Volozhin, the famous Reb Zelmaleh, who was also a Talmud of the Vilna Gaon, and he told him, tell him, the Goin tells Reb Chaim Volozhin, tell your brother Reb Zelmaleh, that he's going to have an apparition of a Maggid. A Maggid is going to come to offer it to learn with him. Tell him he shouldn't accept. And the Goin explained himself. He said, it's true that the Beis Yosef had a Maggid, which means he accepted learning with a Maggid. He said, but that was 200 years ago. The generations were a better massive than they are today. V'hoya shori al admas hakodesh. It's because the Beis Yosef was an Eretz Yisrael, so he could handle it. So that was okay. But today, it's going to be mixed with all kinds of other things, with Tuma, so you can't accept it. Tell Reb Zalman that he shouldn't accept it. So Rabbi Grunwald says, I'm sorry, if you ever read the Maggid, you'll see that almost everything happens in Chutz La'aretz. And he writes something very interesting, and that makes me think that Rabbi Grunwald didn't really read the Sefer Maggid either, because it got him so upset. He was just looking for his points to attack, but he didn't really learn it seriously. Because he's writing like this, he's writing that it has to be that the Goin, you see that the Goin didn't read the Sefer HaMaggid, because if he had read it, he would see that hundreds of times the Maggid is giving Rabbi Yosef Karo over the head. Why didn't you go yet to Eretz Yisrael? He's like giving him Techeicha, why didn't you go to Eretz Yisrael? And so, it must be that the Goin never even read it. So he's like, the Goin didn't read it, so the fact that he's referring to it doesn't really prove anything. That's what he's saying. It's a very interesting argument. Now, you read through the Maggid. How many times does the Maggid, he reprove the Rabbi Yosef Karo for not going to Eretz Yisrael? Once. As far as I know, there's only once. Many times tell him, you're going to be Zeicha to go to Eretz Yisrael. He promises him you're going to get there. He speaks about it. But once where he actually says, why didn't you go? It happens once. And he explains, the first year you had a good answer because there's a war going on, because this, because that. And then this happened, and then this happened. But now you could have already gone to Adrianopol and be on the way to Eretz Yisrael, waiting for the war to end, and then be ready to go. So actually, it's only one time where he's telling him, why didn't you go to Eretz Yisrael? He's speaking about hundreds of times that he's being mechichim for not going to Eretz Yisrael. But the argument is a real argument. You have to understand what the Goyen is saying. He's saying that the Maggid Meisham was written in Eretz Yisrael. It wasn't. Most of it really wasn't. And now that we have the dates for most of it, so you can see that actually 80% was written in Chutz La'aretz. So that is a question. That is a question. Now, if you don't mind, can I give my take on it?
Yes, for sure.
When you speak about the Maggid in Eretz Yisrael rather than in Chutz La'aretz, which is one of the points that come up with the Ramchal, the Ramosh Cham, the Tzatos Maggid, also, how can you have a Maggid when you're not in Eretz Yisrael? So, you have this idea that a Maggid is this type of thing, Madrega, that could be Zeichel only in Eretz Yisrael. Why is that? If you look at the sources over there by the Ramchal, everyone's talking about because it's a type of a nevuah. We know that today there's no prophecy, right? There's no, I just heard this week, someone gave a quip that he doesn't know Nevi'im because he learned in the yeshiva, and the yeshiva is a non-profit institution. So, it's a type of nevuah, a Maggid. And nevuah is only, there's no nevuah since Churban Bayis Rishon. So, that's why they say that even though there's no nevuah, but there still is a type of minor nevuah, which is the Maggid. And just as nevuah needs the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, so the Maggid also needs the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. That's the idea. That's why we would say that only in Eretz Yisrael. Now, the Gemara, when the Gemara Moed Katan, I think, talks about there's no nevuah in Eretz Yisrael, in Chutz La'aretz, right? So the Gemara asks about certain Nevi'im that did have nevuah in Chutz La'aretz, Yecheskel, etc. And the Gemara gives different answers, but there's a famous Kuzari, Rabbi Levi, which writes that Kol HaNevi'im shenisnabu lo nisnabu ela bo oy ba'avuro, which means that nevuah could be either in Eretz Yisrael or something that has to do for the sake of Eretz Yisrael, which is why Moshe Rabbeinu gets his nevuah outside, because Klal Yisrael is going into Eretz Yisrael. All the nevuahs have to do with going into Eretz Yisrael, even if you're not in Eretz Yisrael. And I think that's the idea that the Goyen was saying. Even though most of the Sefer was written in Chutz La'aretz, but the theme of the Sefer, and it's very, very clear when you read seriously, when you read meticulously the Igeres of Reb Shem Alkabetz on Leil Shavuos, the main theme of the Sefer is going to Eretz Yisrael. It's like bringing the Beis Yosef and his Chabura back to Eretz Yisrael. And actually, that's why the whole Sefer HaMaggid has to do with the whole rebirth of Tzfas in that time. That means that the whole story of the Smicha, the Chiddush of Smicha and everything, it's all coming directly from the Maggid, who's sending up a whole group of big Talmidei Chacham, the biggest of the generation, sending them to Eretz Yisrael. And that's why it's, the Goyen is saying that had to do with Eretz Yisrael.
And all of that is why it's so important that we now have the Avat Shalom edition arranged chronological order, as a diary, as it was written, as an autobiography, if you will, in order with extra new material that they added from manuscript. And so it's important to show, you really can see, without a shadow of a doubt, it was Rav Yosef Karo. He wrote it, his work. We now have this work with the great job that they did. And as you said, you're even giving them corrections and things that they're adding and correcting. And that's really episode 2 when discussing Rav Yosef Karo and specifically the Maggid Meisharim and Sefer HaMaggid. In episode 3, we're going to try to get into more on Sefer HaMaggid. I'll tease what we have to discuss the Shavuos night and the popularity of the Shavuos night letter, Rav Shlomo Kabetz and Shlomo Molcho, and were they mixed up or not, the different things, Shlomo Chavivi and the burning and all that you mentioned. If we should touch on that more on this more Teracha, also the Torah. I mean, we didn't really get into the Torah. We're not going to go heavy on the Kabbalah, but I think we should give some examples, talk about the Torah, and Loi Bashamayim, halachas, and Maggid Meisharim, halachas that don't shtim, that don't work. There's also different figures in Maggid Meisharim throughout the years, and so on. So there are some more parts and aspects to get to that we have to still cover that we didn't get to yet. But here, as we get to the end of episode 2, let me turn it to you, Moshé. Anything that you want to end with?
Yes, actually, I mentioned just now the way I see the Sefer HaMaggid as I understand that the Vilna Gaon understands that it has to do with going up to Eretz Yisrael, because it's in a very important stage of repopulating of Eretz Yisrael, the first time since the time of the Amoraim, where you really have a huge kehillah of Gdolei Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael, and the Maggid's still going on at that time. That means that it goes on till quite late in Beis Yosef's life, when his son is born, when he's already in his late 70s, I think. So we're speaking about that Kufa and Sfas, that era. And one of the things I love talking about, and if anyone's interested in inviting me as a scholar in residence, one of the things I love to speak about is the reinstitution of the Smicha in Sfas in 1538 in Reis Tzadik Ches, when Rabbi Rav suggested making the Smicha. And one of the things that we have about the Smicha is in the Maggid Meishorim, he tells them, since you were Moise Nefesh on the Smicha, so you'll be Zeiche that your Psokim, your Alochas, will be accepted by all Klal Yisrael, because you were Moise Nefesh on the Smicha. Now, we don't really have sources of what was Rav Yosef Karo's Mesiras Nefesh for the Smicha. Where do you invest so much? What we do know is Professor Chaim Zalman Dmitrovsky wrote about it at length, and he showed that actually there was an internal dispute, very, very intense dispute, between the Mabit and the Beis Yosef, which had to do with carrying on the smicha right after was given by the Rabbi Rav. There was a technical way to how to proceed with the smicha, and it got to a point where actually Rav Yosef Karo was kicked out of the Beis HaMedrash. That's something that's not really recorded, but he managed to find it in different letters, that there was such a time where Rav Yosef Karo was wanted to go further with the smicha, and the other Talmidim of Rabbi Rav did not accept that. And actually, Rav Yosef Karo for a time was like quarantined in a certain way. And after you read Dmitrovsky's information, you understand something that the Maggid Meishorim is telling him. It's about the year Shin Beis, which is like 4 years after the Chidush HaSmicha. And he says that even though they kicked you out of the Knesset Agdoyle, and now you had to go daven in the Chorva, and he's speaking like in these type of terms, that he was in the Knesset Agdoyle, now he's kicked out, now he has to be in the Chorva with the people who are not roy to be in the Knesset Agdoyle, and he was kicked out. He says, Emir Hashem, you're going to be the head of all of them. And what's he referring to? So Altshuler decided that Knesset Agdoyle is Tzfas and the Chorva is Yerushalayim, because that was the situation. And there was a time where Beis Yosef had to leave Tzfas to go to Yerushalayim. That's just like nothing to do. What Knesset Agdoyle is referring to is very simple, because when you know the history of Tzfas, Kahal Gadol or Kahal Majora was simply the big shul in Tzfas, which was I think the Castilians, that was a major shul, and that's where everything was going on, and he was kicked out. And it could be he actually went to daven with the Balei Tshuva. The Balei Tshuva, those who had their own community in Tzfas, and they were the ones who came to ask for Malkus from Rabbi Rav, and for who the Rabbi Rav said that he wants to reinstitute the smicha to be able to give them Malkus, so they should feel that they had finished their tshuva. That was in 2 words, the background of the Chidush HaSmicha was because of these Balei Tshuva. They had their own community in Tzfas. Kila K'doisha Balei Tshuva. They found remnants of, I think, Atzei Chaim from a Sefer Torah, on which it said, Kuf Kuf, Kila K'doisha Balei Tshuva. And it sounds like that because of this machlokes which they had, Rabbi Yosef Karo was like distanced. He was like kicked out because actually the Mabit was a closer Talmud to Rabbi Rav. Rabbi Rav got upset at him, and it's something that it has everything to do with the building of Tzfas and with the whole going out from Tzfas to the whole Torah world of the Shulchan Aruch and its Psokim, of the Kabbalah, of the Ramak and Arizal. Everything's going on over there, but how it happens is because there's a Maggid who sent up a whole group of the biggest Talmid Chacham of the generation to be over there, and they're fighting it out to know how to proceed, how to do it. And it's happening. And today, everything we have in the Halacha and Kabbalah, everything comes from there, from those. And really, when you realize what the story is, and you read in the new edition, you get a real clear picture about it. It's unbelievable.
It's fascinating. I think what we didn't do justice to, and it's not possible, is the work, the Sefer HaMaggid, and really reading this new edition and how fascinating it really is, even without the Kabbalah, but just reading the autobiography and reading the diary from one part to the next. I mean, hopefully we give some sort of flavor for that, and anyone interested to really just pick up the Avad Shalom edition and really read it, and it's really fascinating, a very cool read, and really gives you an insight into a different time and a different place, something that you know about, but now you could really learn more about it, especially now that it's in its original form, the way it was written as a diary. So you can check that out, and we'll get more into the Torah in the next episode. So thank you, Rabbi Moshé, for joining me on the second episode.
Thank you very much for having me.
And I want to add, and I forgot to add, you said as a scholar in residence, anyone wants to invite you, yes, you can say your email if anyone wants to talk to you. And now I said, I introduced you as Rabbi Moshé, Rabbi Doctor, because now you're a PhD, you got a PhD on the Sforno, so besides for being a Reb and Rabbi, you also have to get the doctor. So if anyone needs you have the necessary credentials now.
Right, even though I heard from Reb Shlomo Zalman that's something you don't write on the Matzeva, you don't give Mazel Tov for. So I don't plan to have doctor written on the Matzeva, but yes, I do have it. Baruch Hashem.
Okay,
thank you very much, Nachi.
Okay, and I'll say if you want to, what's your email for the listeners? If anyone wants to get in touch with you.
So Sforno, SFORNO.MK, like member of Knesset or Moshé Kravetz, gmail.com.
Okay, I'll put it in the show notes as well, and looking forward to the next one. Thank you.
Thank you very much.